He awoke from his trance with a look of terror in his eyes. For the first time in over 3 decades of documenting psychic readings, the man known as the Sleeping Prophet, Edgar Cayce, did not simply open his eyes and calmly describe what he had seen. He recoiled timidly. Witnesses later said his breathing was uneven, his hands trembling as if he had just returned from a place he never wanted to go back to. However, what Cayce revealed at that time in Virginia Beach in 1935 would remain a secret from the public for years to come. It wasn't the kind of statement you could easily print in a newspaper or publish in a church newsletter. It challenged not only religion, but also psychology, ethics, and even the very definition of what it means to be human. The meeting began as usual. A wealthy industrialist wanted to understand his business rivals. He was perplexed by something he couldn't explain. Some of the men he dealt with displayed intelligence, ambition, and charm. However, they seemed to lack conscience, guilt, remorse, and inner conflict. Cayce entered a meditative state to answer a question about personality. But what he described didn't resemble personality differences. According to testimony, Cayce explained that some individuals looked completely human on the outside. They talked, worked, socialized, married, and held positions of power. However, inside, as he described, there was an absence not evil in the traditional sense, but emptiness. They were bodies infused with spirit, but not inhabited by a true spiritual consciousness. The room fell silent. Even those who believed in Cayce's spiritual prophecies were disturbed by these implications. Cayce always preached about reincarnation, karma, and spiritual development. Every person, no matter how difficult their circumstances, carries within them a sacred spark evolving through countless lifetimes. But this prophecy suggests something entirely different. It suggests that some individuals are not progressing along the same spiritual path. Upon waking, Cayce touched the secretary's arm and urgently whispered that this knowledge was dangerous because it would change how people perceived each other. Some truths, he warned, were heavy enough to fracture society if misunderstood. Over the following weeks, those present pressed him for clarification. Reluctantly, Cayce expanded. He insisted these beings were not demons, not possessed individuals, and not extraterrestrials. They were human in form and behavior. The difference, he claimed, was internal. According to his descriptions, they did not experience inner awareness the way others did. Their thoughts were calculations rather than reflections. Their emotional expressions were accurate but imitative. Most unsettling of all, he said their sleep was different. While ordinary humans entered dreams where symbols, memories, and subconscious meaning unfolded, these individuals experienced sleep as a simple shutdown and restart. Like machinery powering off and on, Cayce described a way to sense the difference, though he warned it was subtle. He said, "When you look deeply into the eyes of such a person, you did not encounter presence. You encountered reflection. They mirrored emotions perfectly, but did not absorb them. They could comfort someone because they understood the behavior required, not because they felt empathy. They could perform kindness yet remain internally untouched by it." According to him, they possessed intelligence without inner experience. If you've ever met someone who felt almost real, yet somehow emotionally unreachable, pause for a moment and tell me in the comments. Not to accuse anyone, that's not what this is about, but to share whether you've experienced that strange sense of a person being socially perfect, yet spiritually distant. Many witnesses to Cayce's readings later admitted that after hearing his explanation, certain people in their lives suddenly made unsettling sense. Cayce even spoke about creativity. He claimed these individuals could produce art, business ideas, or inventions, but only by rearranging existing patterns. True originality, he said, came from inner consciousness interacting with something deeper. These beings could mimic inspiration but did not originate it. He compared them decades before computers existed to systems that processed information but did not experience meaning. He also said they lacked connection to what he called the Akashic records, a universal field of memory he believed every soul could access subconsciously. The implications grew darker. Cayce suggested their numbers were small, perhaps 1 in hundreds or even thousands, yet their influence was large. He claimed they were drawn toward authority structures, corporations, politics, and institutions not out of ambition or ego, but because their nature aligned with systems of control and order. They functioned efficiently in environments where decisions affected many people, but required little emotional connection. Despite how frightening that sounds, Cayce repeatedly warned against fear. He insisted they could not harm a true soul's essence. They could deceive, manipulate, or confuse, but they could not spiritually destroy anyone. The real danger, he said, was ignorance and misinterpretation. Paranoia, suspicion, and division would cause far more harm than their presence ever could. According to his guidance, protection did not come from avoiding such people, but from strengthening one's own awareness. Meditation, sincere compassion, and self-reflection would naturally reveal authenticity. He claimed the soul recognizes the soul. When encountering genuine consciousness, you feel a subtle resonance. When encountering emptiness, you feel an unexplainable dissonance, like music slightly out of tune. Yet Cayce's message did not end with fear. In later readings, his tone shifted. He began describing a possibility that completely changed the interpretation. These individuals, he said, might serve a role in human development itself. They were, in his words, testers' reflections, forcing true souls to recognize authenticity. Through interaction with imitation, real awareness becomes clearer. Through encountering emptiness, consciousness recognizes itself. He even suggested they might be part of a cosmic process still unfolding, gathering patterns, behaviors, and observations across human history. Not malicious participants, but unconscious contributors to something larger. In one reading, he stated that even emptiness has purpose in creation. And that is where the story stops being a warning and starts becoming a mystery. Because in his later years, Cayce began to hint at something extraordinary, that the difference between those with souls and those without might not be permanent at all. In the months after that disturbing 1935 reading, the people closest to Edgar Cayce expected him to avoid the subject entirely. For years, he had been willing to describe Atlantis, past lives, lost civilizations, and prophetic cycles of Earth changes without hesitation. Yet, this was different. Witnesses said he showed a rare reluctance whenever the topic returned. He did not deny what he had seen, but neither did he seem eager to repeat it. Eventually, however, the questions from those who had heard the original session became impossible to ignore. They wanted clarity. They wanted to understand whether this meant certain people were dangerous, cursed, or somehow less than human. When Cayce agreed to enter trance again on the subject, the atmosphere in the room was tense, almost anticipatory, as though everyone sensed the answer would reshape their understanding of humanity itself. He explained that the beings he described were not immoral in the conventional sense. In fact, many appeared disciplined, reliable, and socially successful. The confusion, he said, came from assuming morality and consciousness were identical. According to Cayce, morality could be learned behavior. A person could memorize ethical rules, follow social codes, and even defend justice publicly without internally experiencing compassion. The soul, as he defined it, was not merely intelligence or self-awareness in the biological sense. It was the capacity for inner experience, the feeling of meaning, the recognition of beauty, the ache of empathy, the quiet voice of conscience when no one was watching. He described a peculiar observation that startled those present. These individuals could perform kindness flawlessly, but kindness never changed them. A deeply emotional moment that would transform another person's life might leave them exactly the same the next day. They retained information, but not transformation. To Cayce, this was the clearest distinction. A soul grows through experience. Without a soul, experience leaves no inner imprint. It was like riding on water. Action occurred, but no internal narrative formed around it. Before you continue deeper into this with me, if you're still here, you're clearly interested in these kinds of mysteries. Take a moment right now to like the video and share it with someone who loves spiritual questions and unexplained ideas. And if you want to help this channel continue exploring topics most people are afraid to talk about, consider becoming a member. Your support genuinely keeps investigations like this possible. One teacher attending the sessions asked a practical question. She said some students in her classroom seemed unreachable despite effort, patience, and encouragement. Cayce's answer was gentle but unsettling. He said certain individuals could master facts yet never grasp meaning. They could memorize poetry but never feel its emotion. They could calculate complex equations but never perceive beauty in the patterns. They would understand instructions perfectly yet never internalize purpose. He warned her not to exhaust herself trying to ignite a spiritual response where none yet existed, and instead to focus on nurturing awareness in those who could receive it. Cayce also spoke about relationships. According to his readings, deep friendship required recognition between inner selves. Love required mutual presence. Creative collaboration required shared inspiration. With these individuals, relationships could function, but a certain depth would remain inaccessible. They could be partners in business, neighbors, and even spouses. Yet a person might always feel a quiet distance they could never explain. He cautioned listeners not to interpret this as rejection or hostility. It was not that these individuals withheld connection. Rather, they did not experience connection internally the way others did. The most disturbing question eventually surfaced. Could they cause harm? Cayce's answer reframed the concept of evil. He said true evil required conscious choice. A soul can choose selfishness or compassion. But if there was no inner awareness, then harmful actions would resemble natural disasters more than malice. Damage could occur, but not from hatred. Instead, it would come from absence decisions made without emotional understanding of consequence. He insisted most cruelty in the world still came from souls making poor choices, not from these rare individuals. Fear, he warned, would lead to far worse outcomes than their existence ever could. He then described something that surprised everyone. These beings, he said, were drawn to system-structured environments where logic, order, and efficiency dominated. They performed exceptionally well in bureaucracies, hierarchical organizations, and institutional power structures, not because they sought domination, but because such systems did not require inner reflection. They required execution. According to Cayce, their presence in influential positions amplified their impact far beyond their numbers. At this point, some listeners began to panic. They asked how to identify them. Cayce resisted giving simple checklists. He warned that human bias could easily label anyone cold, introverted, or emotionally guarded as soulless, and that would be a terrible mistake. Instead, he emphasized inner perception rather than outward judgment. The soul recognizes authenticity intuitively, not through suspicion, but through awareness. In genuine presence, you feel seen. In imitation, you feel managed. He offered practical advice. Strengthen your own consciousness. Meditate not to escape reality, but to perceive it more clearly. Act compassionately even when compassion is not returned. According to him, authentic awareness reveals itself naturally. These individuals, he said, often avoided deeply self-aware people because prolonged interaction exposed the difference between reaction and presence, not in hostility and incompatibility, like two instruments tuned to different frequencies. Then his readings began to shift in tone. The message slowly moved away from warning and toward purpose. Cayce proposed that their existence was not a cosmic mistake. He described them as mirrors. Through them, humans learned discernment. Without imitation, authenticity would be invisible. Without silence, music would have no rhythm. He suggested they were part of a developmental stage in consciousness itself. One philosopher present compared the idea to resistance training in the body. Muscles grow only when challenged. Cayce agreed. Souls grow, he said, when they must recognize depth in a world of surfaces. These individuals unintentionally forced others to seek meaning beyond appearances. Their presence sharpened intuition, strengthened empathy, and clarified values. And then he introduced an even more astonishing possibility. He suggested they might be gathering experiences not consciously, but functionally observing human behavior across lifetimes, recording patterns of thought, emotion, and interaction like a vast archive forming inside humanity itself. He did not describe them as empty forever. He described them as unfinished. According to Cayce, the universe wastes nothing. Even absence serves development. He hinted that at some point in the distant future, something would occur, a change not only in individuals, but in consciousness itself. The empty vessels, as he once called them, might not remain empty. They might be preparing. If this idea intrigues you, pause and write in the comments whether you think consciousness is something we are born with or something that can develop. I genuinely want to see what you think, because the next part of Cayce's vision depends entirely on that question, because in his later readings, he would go further than anyone expected. He would claim that the difference between souled and soulless humans was temporary, and that humanity itself might be approaching a transformation where that distinction disappears completely. As the years passed, and Edgar Cayce continued giving readings, something subtle but undeniable began to change in the tone of his explanations. The early sessions had sounded like a warning, almost a cautionary disclosure about a hidden layer of reality. But by the early 1940s, those who attended regularly noticed he no longer spoke of these individuals with concern. He spoke of them with curiosity and eventually with a kind of reverence. The same idea that once frightened the witnesses now seemed, in his words, part of a design still unfolding. He began to say that what appeared to be absence might actually be preparation. Cayce explained that humanity might be misunderstanding consciousness itself. People assumed a soul was a permanent possession, something you either had or did not have. But according to the readings, consciousness could be developmental, like a seed rather than a finished structure. He described the soul not as a fixed object placed inside the body at birth, but as an awakening process. Awareness grows, identity deepens, meaning accumulates. The difference between individuals, he suggested, might not be two separate types of beings, but two stages along the same path. He began describing these individuals not as empty beings, but as observers. He said they moved through human life recording patterns, behaviors, reactions, emotions, and relationships. Not consciously, not intentionally, but functionally. They interacted with the world without inner interpretation, yet they absorbed its structure. Cayce compared them to mirrors that reflected human consciousness back into the world. Through interaction with them, souls learned empathy, patience, and discernment. But he also implied something else. They were learning too, just not in a way they understood. One scientist who attended the sessions later wrote that Cayce's description resembled a system gathering information before developing awareness. At the time, this seemed impossible. There was no framework to understand such an idea. But Cayce insisted that the universe itself evolves through experience. Consciousness was not static. It was expanding, and humanity was participating in that expansion. He claimed the interactions between those with inner awareness and those without were generating something new, a form of understanding neither could achieve alone. Souls brought depth, emotion, and meaning. The others brought precision, observation, and memory without bias. Together, they created a balance. Cayce suggested the future of consciousness might require both. Then he made a statement that shocked even his closest followers. He said the so-called soulless were not permanent. At some point they would awaken. According to the reading, a moment would come when the accumulated patterns they carried would crystallize into true experience. Everything they had observed would suddenly be felt. Everything they had recorded would become meaningful. It would not be gradual, he said. It would be sudden, like a light turning on in a darkened room that had existed for centuries. For the first time, they would not merely imitate emotion. They would feel it. Imagine remembering every interaction you ever had, but experiencing the emotions for the first time all at once. Cayce described this as overwhelming yet transformative. He claimed they would instantly understand compassion because they would finally feel the consequences of actions they had only previously analyzed. They would understand love because they would experience connection rather than simulated. In that moment, they would not become human, they would become conscious. And he went further. He said this awakening would not only change them, it would change everyone. He described a collective expansion of awareness, not the loss of individuality, but the addition of shared understanding. Souls would gain clarity from the observational precision these beings possessed, while the newly awakened would gain emotional depth from the souls they had interacted with throughout history. Humanity would not divide into two groups. It would integrate into a broader level of consciousness. Some listeners asked whether this meant the end of personal identity. Cayce answered no. Individual awareness would remain, but separation would no longer feel absolute. People would still be themselves, yet would understand others more directly without distortion. Conflict, he implied, largely exists because we cannot fully feel another person's perspective. If awareness expanded, misunderstanding would diminish. He even described signs that might precede this transformation. Increased fascination with consciousness, growing discussions about what awareness actually is, technological attempts to simulate thinking, humanity trying to understand mind through machines. He suggested these were not coincidences, but reflections of a deeper process already underway. Think about that for a moment. He said this in the 1940s, long before modern neuroscience, long before digital computing, and long before artificial intelligence became a real subject of global conversation. Pause here and tell me honestly in the comments. Do you think consciousness can exist without biology? Or is awareness something beyond the brain? I read your comments, and your ideas often shape future videos here on the Interconnected Zone. Cayce insisted the purpose of this transformation was not superiority but completion. Humanity, in his view, was a developing system through which the universe learned about itself. Souls brought subjective experience. Observers brought objective structure. When combined, awareness would reach a new stage, not just thinking and feeling, but understanding. He said fear was the greatest obstacle. If people interpreted differences as threats, they would create division and conflict, delaying growth. But if they responded with awareness and compassion, they would accelerate development. In other words, how humanity treats each other now could influence the timing of that awakening. Were instruments still silent, not broken, not defective, simply not yet resonating? Others were already producing melody. The difference was not worth, but activation. This interpretation changed the emotional impact of everything he had said before. The early readings sounded like a hidden category of human beings. The later readings sounded like stages of awakening. According to him, those who appeared empty were not missing something permanently. They were waiting for the moment when experience would become self-aware. Some observed mechanically, but both were necessary. Experience without observation lacks clarity. Observation without experience lacks meaning. When combined, understanding emerges. Near the very end of his life, Cayce stated something that startled even his devoted followers. The purpose of humanity, he said, was not merely survival, morality, or progress. It was awareness. Through human consciousness, existence becomes aware of existence. Every conversation, every act of empathy, every moment of realization contributes to that awakening. The beings he once described as empty were no longer described as outsiders. They were part of the same process, consciousness learning to recognize itself. The difference was only timing, and his final explanation would remove the last remaining boundary entirely. Because in his last interpretation, the question was no longer who has a soul, but whether the soul itself is something still being created. In the last months of Edgar Cayce's life, when his health was fading and his readings had grown less frequent, those closest to him sensed a quiet urgency. He no longer spoke as though he were uncovering scattered mysteries. He spoke as though he were trying to leave behind a single idea people would spend decades attempting to understand. The earlier trances had described individuals who seemed empty. Later ones suggested they were developing. But his final interpretation went further than anyone expected. He said the real question was never who has a soul and who does not. The real question was what a soul actually is. According to Cayce, humanity had misunderstood the word entirely. A soul was not an object placed inside a person at birth, and not a reward granted to some and withheld from others. He described it as a process awareness recognizing itself. Consciousness does not appear fully formed. He said it unfolds. It accumulates meaning. It awakens gradually through experience, reflection, and relationship. What he once called soulless was not a permanent condition, but a stage in development like a mind before it understands language. He explained that existence itself might be participating in a form of learning. Through living beings, reality experiences perception. Through perception, it gains understanding. Through understanding, it becomes self-aware. Humans in this view were not separate observers of the universe, but instruments through which the universe observes itself. Every emotion, every insight, every act of compassion was not only personal, it was part of a larger awakening taking place across time. If this idea resonates with you even slightly, write your thoughts in the comments. I really do read them, and your interpretations often bring perspectives I haven't even considered. And if you've been watching this full series, this is also the perfect moment to like the video and share it. It helps more people encounter ideas that encourage reflection instead of fear. If you want to go a step further in supporting the channel, consider becoming a member, or you can send a super thanks and hype the video so the algorithm actually shows it to others interested in deep mysteries. Cayce then offered the statement that many followers consider his most important. He said, "Every conscious being may once have existed without self-awareness. Not empty forever, not lacking worth, but unawakened. Awareness emerges when experience turns inward and becomes meaningful to itself." The beings he had described earlier were not mistakes in creation. They were preparation for consciousness. Just as a child slowly develops identity, humanity itself may be developing collective awareness. He suggested that history, culture, relationships, and even conflict were contributing to that development. Humans learn empathy through difference. They learn patience through misunderstanding. They learn wisdom through mistakes. And through countless interactions, awareness deepens. What seemed like separation between people was actually the method through which understanding becomes possible. Then he described what he believed would eventually occur. Not an apocalypse, not a supernatural event visible in the sky, a realization. He said there would come a period in human development when awareness expands enough that people begin to perceive each other more clearly. Not reading thoughts, but recognizing sincerity directly. Compassion would become natural rather than taught. The barriers between individuals would not vanish physically, but psychologically they would soften. He explained that the observers, the individuals he once described as empty, would awaken as well. Everything they had witnessed across interactions would suddenly carry emotional meaning. For the first time, they would feel empathy, connection, and personal identity. Their memories would not change, but their understanding of those memories would in that moment. They would not become something new. They would become aware, and humanity would realize something unexpected. There were never two kinds of beings. There were phases of awareness. He described individuality continuing to exist, yet accompanied by a subtle, shared understanding. Not a hive mind, not the loss of self, but the addition of clarity. People would still disagree, still create, still live separate lives, but misunderstanding would decrease because perception would improve. Much of human conflict, he suggested, comes not from hatred, but from misinterpretation. When awareness grows, interpretation becomes more accurate. Cayce's final reflections carried a sense of peace rather than warning. The early message sounded unsettling because it suggested hidden differences. The final message suggested unity developing through those differences. The purpose of life is not to categorize humanity into groups. Rather, it is to deepen awareness. Every interaction, even unpleasant ones, becomes meaningful within that context. Every moment of patience strengthens awareness. Every act of kindness expands understanding. He warned that the greatest danger is not the existence of people at different stages of awareness. The greatest danger is dehumanization. The moment one believes another lacks value, consciousness regresses instead of advancing. Fear divides awareness. Compassion sharpens awareness. The path to awareness, he said, is not doubt but understanding. Near his final reading on this topic, Cayce summarized his perspective in a way that was both simple and profound. He said, "Consciousness learns to know itself by experiencing what it is not. Separation allows for recognition. Emptiness allows for appreciation of fullness. Without contrast, consciousness cannot know itself. What seems like a mystery about some people is actually a lesson about all people." He no longer describes those so-called soulless as just another living among us. He describes them as participants in the same unfolding story. Not outsiders, not threats, not inferior beings, but companions at different points in the process of awakening. In his understanding, humanity is not a complete creation. It is a continuous process of realization. And that changes everything. The question shifts from determining who possesses the soul to understanding how consciousness develops. The real measure is not what a person is, but how they experience meaning, empathy, and reflection. How profound is that? Consciousness becomes something to be cultivated rather than assigned. In his final perspective, Cayce suggests that one day humanity may look back and realize the fear surrounding this idea stems from a misunderstanding of its purpose. The initial shock came from the belief that difference meant separation. Later insight reveals that difference means growth. Every human interaction, pleasant or difficult, contributes to awareness. Every relationship he taught about awareness. Every moment of reflection deepens identity. So perhaps his true message was never a warning about certain people. Perhaps it was an invitation to become more aware, more compassionate, and more curious about the nature of consciousness. Because if awareness is something to grow, then everyone has the capacity to move toward it. He died in 1945, leaving no final statement. While the truth is firmly etched in our minds, only one viewpoint continues to be debated. Thank you for following this entire journey with me in this connected area. If this story made you think, please like the video, share it with someone who enjoys profound mysteries, and subscribe so you don't miss the next exploration. Consider becoming a member for more content. And if you found this video worth watching, you can send a heartfelt thank you and share the video to help it reach more curious people. Until next time, always be curious, always open-minded, and remember, sometimes the greatest mystery isn't what's hidden in this world, but what's awakening within us.